Thank you very much. All right, now I do a lot of speeches recently, but this speech means more to me because I'm actually back in my hometown doing this speech. This is where a lot of my life experience come from, and I've never actually talked to my home crew, and I've got my family back there and some old friends back there who were with me through it all, through the whole transformation, and they can see the turnaround. And it's just humbling to be up here speaking to my home in Adelaide, and I really appreciate you coming to listen to me. So, who am I? I'm Joey Carbstrong. My actual name is Joey Armstrong. It's just a sort of a play between carbs and Armstrong. Carbs are predominantly vegan, but I'm a vegan activist, an animal liberation activist. I'm a sober lifestyle promoter. I'm also an ex-gang member and an ex-drug user. And I'll tell you how all that come about. So the reason I tell my story is it's an integral part of who I am, okay? Now, this story only come back to me recently. It's a story about when I was playing with my little brother at the back of my mum's house, and it come back to me when I went vegan. And it's very significant because I remember playing out the back of my mum's house on Christmas morning, and my little brother Josh was playing close to these ants. And I was like, Josh, don't step on the ants, it's Christmas. I didn't want to see an ant get hurt on Christmas. It's interesting because later I was conditioned to think it's normal and natural to eat a piece of a cow who'd probably been bolt gunned in the head and suffered greatly. I was conditioned to that. And later on I was conditioned to gang violence, to think that gang violence was normal and natural too. So it speaks of our innate compassion we have for animals as a kid. You know, like no kid wants to see an animal get hurt. You show a child a slaughterhouse, they wouldn't want to eat that food, okay? So somewhere along the line, it's been programmed out of us. Somewhere along the line, we've been lied to. You know, that it's been hidden from us. So where most of my journey started was when I started to experiment with drug use. Now, a lot of kids do this around the same age, about 13, 14, and I sort of was a lost youth, and what I didn't understand the nature of reality. I didn't understand myself. I didn't understand the world, and I was an extreme personality, so it was just me, and I just really I sought solitude in the drug use. And at first it was a bit of fun, and this is how it starts, but I didn't realize I had a predisposition to addiction, okay? Now, some people can have a beer here and there, but I'm not one of those people. I'm all or nothing. And I started to hang around people I thought were like me, okay? So they might have been from a low-income community, their parents are split up, they're experimenting with drugs themselves, they're a bit of lost youth, they might have been conditioned to some violence, and this is how it starts. This is how, it's the environment that slowly starts to shape you. If I put any one of you in a harsh environment, you learn to adapt to it, and it just becomes normal. Okay, so I'll talk about the two wolves. Now, we all have a negative wolf and a positive wolf. It's an Indian proverb. And the one that survives is the one that you feed the most. Now, from a young age, I started feeding this negative wolf. I always had compassion in my heart because I didn't want to see an ant get hurt when I was 5. But it started to become clouded. Okay, it was clouded with the drug use. It was clouded by the alcohol. It was clouded by my friends around me who would, they would sort of, it was motivational to go out and, have a big brawl on the weekend. Your mates looked up to that sort of thing. So the environment's shaping you. And where it all progresses to is like I started using more and more drugs. I started dealing drugs to sort of feed my habit, okay? And I started to get into it a lot heavier. And people don't have a drug problem, they've got a reality problem. That's what it is. I've heard that, Russell Brand says that, and it's so true. So they're using drugs to escape their reality. But if you make your reality livable, a happy reality, then you won't need to use drugs to sort of blanket and cloud and you deal with emotion and stuff like that. So I started to develop serious mental issues. I had anxiety, I had a lot of depression. I had a lot of pent-up rage and aggression. It was spilling out onto people around me. It was spilling out to my family. It was spilling out onto my friends. And I've even gone so far as I spent a week in the mental ward once. I remember that. And I remember my mum and my grandfather coming. My grandfather was dying of cancer at the time. And I remember them seeing me in that place. And I was just too out of it. But I do remember my grandfather just looking at me and crying. He was crying because he was sad, because he was in his last days, and it was the last place he wanted to see me, in that place. So a lot of things happen to you in this world. A lot of things happen to you. I see this circle of actions having reactions. I've been bashed, I've been bottled, I've been run over, I've been held hostage at gunpoint. These are the types of things that happen in this environment a lot. But there was one significant thing that happened to me, and it gave me sort of a realization. I was angry one night. I had a fight with my girlfriend. And when I went out, I had an intention. I put a weapon in my pocket. And we all were drinking, and we went to this bar, and there was another gang outside of the bar. And I started a fight that night that could have been avoided. It could have been avoided. I walked up, and then it happened, a really big, brutal gang fight. Okay, now, they hopped in their car, and they drove away. Now, I thought they had gone, but they hadn't gone. They circled back around the back of the pub. Okay, now, I had one friend on one side, another friend on the other side. And before I knew it, he was coming straight for me, okay? So I jumped up with the car, my friends moved out the way, and I went up in the air. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever had a near-death experience, but everything slows down, okay? And your life literally flashes before your eyes. This actually happens, okay? And I realized something in the air. I was like, I'm dead. I've just died, okay? And it's because of what I asked for. Okay, I went out that night put a weapon in my pocket with a bad intention, and I got what I asked for. And this was one of the first times, right, that I realized that your actions have reactions. Okay, that what you do comes back on you. A very important lesson I learned. But did that stop me? No. I forgot about that when I was walking in a week. Started walking about a week, and all I wanted was revenge. That was it. You know, I didn't think of like, hey, I've just had this near-death experience. Maybe I should have this dramatic change. Nah. I had to learn the hard way. Now, what happened is I started really getting into the drug use. I started being a real arsehole to my friends, and I was having these paranoid episodes, and I was in a very toxic relationship. And I remember I'd caused all these problems around me. And I always had a weapon on me, no matter what, whether it was a hammer, a knife, or it progressed into a gun. I had a firearm down my pants. Now, I thought, I've created all these problems. There's a good way out of this. And I wasn't thinking straight. I'd been up for days, and I thought, this is my way out. So I was sitting on the end of my girlfriend's bed with my gun in my mouth, thinking, hey, flirting with the idea of pulling the trigger. Now, I'm so grateful that I didn't, because I'd never had this chance now to inspire people through my story, okay? Suicide is the permanent solution to a temporary problem, okay? So if you keep going, then you'll make it through, and you never know what's on the other side. So if you're going through hell, you've got to keep going. What ended up happening is gangs turned organised. They weren't no street gangs anymore. They turned into a very dangerous organised crime group where, you know, you could say something wrong and something very serious could happen to you. This was the life I was living. But where it all come to a head was when I got busted. Okay, I got busted with a firearm down my pants at a hotel room. I was with a girl and she was trying to get into her car to get her keys out of her car. And the police were called, of course. It was 2 a.m. Okay, the police searched me once. They said, you're all right, but then after they did the registration check, they searched me again and they found it. They pulled it out of my pants, and there it was. And I went to jail then. My first experience with prison was punishment unit. Two cell checks a day with 10 guards. It was a punishment unit because they wanted to keep me in observation for suicide watch. And they treat you as a punished prisoner. You have to have your cell spotless, stainless steel spotless, no fingerprints on the toilet, nothing. They give you toilet paper to do all this, all right? And if you mess up, you'll know about it, seriously. And I was mourning the death of my grandfather. My grandfather had just died. I was coming down off all these drugs, and I had no television, no nothing in there. And I had to sit there with myself and think about all the things I'd done to my family and my friends, and it was a really, really hard time for me. Luckily, I was only in there for a week. But did that stop me? I was released on house arrest, awaiting my sentencing for the firearm. I fell back into the drugs, back into the violence, back into the gangs, back into the alcohol. I hadn't learned my lesson yet. Now, something happened though while I was on home detention, which was really, really pivotal in my change. I put on a lot of weight. I had limited access to drugs, so I was trying to fill the hole with something else. Okay, so I was using food, calorie-dense food, bacon for breakfast, pork chops, a lot of oil, a lot of junk food. I put on 25 kilos in a short amount of time. And I was looking for the best diet to lose weight. And I come across a raw foodist on the internet, and he was talking about fruits and vegetables and the life-giving plants. I thought he was a bit strange. But he said something really significant to me, and it really planted a very important seed in my mind. He said, when you eat suffering and death and fear from a dead animal, that manifests as disease and fear in your body and anxiety. But when you eat the life-giving plants that are put here for us to eat, you know, it counteracts this disease. These are the foods we're supposed to eat. Now, knowing that actions have reactions from the car accident and seeing what happens in the underworld, it made sense to me. I was like, well, I can't, that animal obviously didn't want to die. Well, like, I'm eating that animal. There's obviously got to be some adverse reaction from that. I don't know how true that is, but it spoke to me. Now, what ended up happening is I stayed in the gangs, kept drinking, and it come to the day of me getting imprisoned. I was sentenced. I got about 13 months on the top, and I had to serve 6 months in prison. Now, what happened in prison, it wasn't like it was a real hard time for me. All my friends were in there. It wasn't like that. But what it was the longest I'd ever been sober for 12 years. 12 years. I'd always been on some type of substance since I was 14, whether it was marijuana, alcohol, meth, Xanax, some type of substance. Now, what ended up happening is I had this epiphany. I could see everything from a new perspective. I had a bird's eye view of my entire life. And I could see that my life is just a collection of all the mistakes I'd made in my past and had led me to there. And I could see people around me doing 5 years, 10 years, 25 years life for one mistake they'd made one night. One mistake. And I didn't want to be that person. I started to wake up. I really started to wake up. I'd never had the sober perspective before. So I ended up getting out. I got out on something else called parole, which was another obstacle to my drug use, okay? I couldn't use on parole. They urine test you. And I remember I was talking to my mum. I was criticizing her for smoking cigarettes. And she said something to me. She said, there's a lot of vices people have that they don't change, okay? So in whatever words she said, it made me reflect. And when I reflected, I was like, well, what is it about me that I haven't changed? And I always seen the hypocrisy in saying that you care about animals or save the whales and save the dolphins. But I had a steak on my plate. I was eating animals 3 times a day, probably more than anyone else. But I seen that hypocrisy and I just hadn't aligned myself with my values yet. So I went vegan, bang, the next day, completely, 100% vegan the next day. And that's how my activist journey started. But I had to find out a few things first. I was training religiously back then. I was doing weights, and I needed to know if I could get protein. Because it is a question you got to ask yourself. Like, I've always been taught I need to eat animals for protein. So I did a bit of research. I found veganbodybuilding.com, and these guys are massive and stronger than I'll ever be. So that sort of solved that. I realized that, hey, the cows are eating the grass. The cows have got muscle on their bodies. Why are we filtering our nutrients through a cow? We could just go straight to the plant-based source. It made a lot of sense to me. Another thing that reinforced it in me is that heart disease is the #1 killer on earth. It's caused by eating saturated fat and cholesterol. Cholesterol is only found in animal products. It's not found in plants. This stuff is building up in people's arteries. The #1 reason why you or a family member will die is because of heart disease. 17 million people annually it kills. Crazy. They're not talking about that. More people than cancer and wars. A vegan's blood is 8 times less hospitable to cancer cell growth. I mean, if you have cancer cells in a petri dish and you drip vegan's blood on it, it kills the cancer cells, okay? Crazy, crazy. Now, the environment, too, has taken a massive, massive destruction from the animal products industry. They're cutting down the Amazon. 91% of Amazon deforestation is to grow soybeans to feed to cows or for grass-fed cattle. They're cutting down the rainforest to the beef industry, basically, or the dairy industry. Now, I had this epiphany, I had this awakening, I was sober, I'd gone vegan. Now I had to leave the gangs, okay? So I had to go and say, you know, it's obviously not for me anymore. And they understood, they seen the transformation I had in my Facebook post looked a lot differently, I tell you, from when I went in to when I got out. So, but, you know, when you leave the gangs at that level, it becomes a little bit more tricky. There's a lot more politics involved, and there was a lot of stuff going on at the time, and I'd never not lived my life without a crutch. I'd always had alcohol to deal with my anxiety. I'd always had my mates to fall back on, but I was on my own after that. Anything I'd done in the past, I was on my own. Any enemies I had, I was on my own then, okay? And it was a very hard time for me. I was riding around on my bike, eating bananas, and I was trying to learn to reintegrate into society sober. I had to relearn how to speak to people. I'd never, had a relationship without drugs. I'd never not, had my mates to fall back on. I spent a lot of time alone. It was the hardest year, but it was the best decision I've ever made. By far, staying sober was the best decision I'd ever made. I don't think I'd be vegan if I wasn't sober. I wouldn't have the clarity of mind. But I couldn't be vegan. I just couldn't just be sober and vegan. My heart was calling out for more. Okay, I had this fire in my chest. Every time I woke up from a sleep, I was like, I'm not doing enough. That's another day gone. I'd spent 12 years of my life taken from people, making people feel like bad. And I wanted to give back. Okay, I want to leave a positive mark. If you died tomorrow, how would you want to be remembered? And that's what was flashing through my mind. Anyone who has that fire inside your chest, never deny yourself of that, because that's your purpose. It's calling out to you, okay? Now, the reason I started to speak up for animals, the animal rights message was galvanizing in me by the day. I love helping people, helping them get sober, off the drugs, and, inspiring them to change their life. But I felt like there was someone out there who needed it more, and it was the animals. The animals have done nothing to deserve what we do to them. Okay, nothing. Literally, only thing they have done wrong is be born onto this earth a different species. If they were born into Australia a dog, a cat, a koala, they wouldn't be herded by the billion into these slaughterhouses. Okay? Crazy what we're doing to these animals. They've done nothing wrong. Now, even in the most humane farm you can think of, okay, the most humane, they give them belly scratches, they give them back massages, they look after these cows like family. The ultimate betrayal is when the farmer puts them on that truck and sends them to exactly the same slaughterhouse that every other animal gets murdered in. Okay, that is the ultimate trust and betrayal. And I've spoken to farmers, and they don't like doing it. They hate it. Okay, they genuinely care about these cows, and they're sending them to a slaughterhouse. This is where it ends. There's no humane way to do this. Now, what did my friends think of this? I remember having a conversation with one of my mates, and he said, Joey, you used to be one of those guys that was so violent towards people. Now you won't even hurt a chicken. And I said, that chicken didn't do nothing wrong to me or you. Okay? That chicken's innocent. And that's how it is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do to animals. I'm not trying to make anyone feel judged. I'm just speaking the truth from my heart, how it is. I'm the last person to judge anyone. I come out of gangs into drug use and eating animals more than anyone else. So if you feel a bit of discomfort, analyze that. Analyze why you're feeling that discomfort. We kill around 70 billion land animals every year for sandwiches and shoes, ridiculous things that we don't need. If you look around, we've got vegan everything, ice cream, burgers. It's so unnecessary. And all animals that are killed are essentially children. No animal reaches adulthood. The oldest they're killed is when they're suffering in the dairy industry for 5 or 6 years. Or baby pigs, okay, their heads smashed on the ground, blunt force trauma if a piglet isn't growing fast enough. In the egg industry, they kill all the male baby chicks. Free-range eggs do this, organic eggs do this. The males are a waste product to the egg industry. They grind them up alive in a macerator, or they suffocate them in a bag or put them in a gas chamber. Okay, this is what we do to the male chicks so we can eat eggs. The hens don't have it any better. All they have to do is lay 300 eggs a year until they're spent. They usually lay about 20. 300 eggs for 18 months they do this, suffering, okay? And then they're killed too. So they all get killed. None of these animals get out alive. Humane slaughter. One of the most horrific things I've ever seen is a pig in a gas chamber. The most humane method for killing pigs in Australia, okay, is a gas chamber. Now, they stun them in these gas chambers, and what happens, you might think, oh, they fall asleep. Yeah, nice and fall asleep, and it's all good. No, they get lowered in a cage into gas, and they burn from the inside out, but a sensation made when carbonic acid happens when the CO2 reacts with the saliva and stuff. So they're suffocating, and they're terrified in these gas chambers. The screams you hear out of them are horrific. And it's also humane welfare standard in the dairy industry in Australia for bobby calves, 1-day-old bobby calves to be killed with blunt force trauma to the head. That means a sledgehammer if there's no other way to kill them. There's no right way to do the wrong thing. Fish. Fish are probably one of the most unrepresented animals on earth. We kill every year 2 to 2.7 trillion, okay, fish. Every year we rip them out of the ocean, they suffocate, we hook them in the face, they're suffering. Now, you might think fish are just like vegetables, they don't feel a thing. Let me tell you about this little experiment. It's called the coloured plate experiment, okay? There's 2 plates with food on each plate. They had primates, fish, and his 4-year-old daughter do the same experiment. The animals had to learn to eat off one plate first, or the other plate would be taken away. The fish, I'm talking trout, fish that people eat, did better than the primates, chimpanzees and stuff, and better than his 4-year-old daughter. Okay, so they're intelligent, and they feel pain, and they suffer. We shouldn't be doing this to them. Now, usually this is the part where I tell vegans how to spread the message, and I'll give you tools on how to do that, because it's one of the most important things we can do. but I'll be doing an activist Q&A in the tent behind us after this, so I'll skip most of that part. But what I will tell you is why it is an obligation for vegans to be active. And what I mean by being an activist it doesn't always mean standing outside on the road with a sign or stopping slaughterhouse trucks. It means being proactive, spreading the message in whatever way you can, whatever skills you have. Highly important. Veganism is just non-participation. You've seen an injustice, you refuse to participate in it, which is good. It's awesome that you've chosen not to participate in this injustice. But the only way you stop it is by intervening, okay? And that's what vegan activism is. If you're neutral in times of injustice, then you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So as vegans, we know very well what happens to these animals. And for us to stand by, if it was any other injustice, an injustice to a human, and you've seen it with your own eyes, you'd intervene. You'd do something about it. But I think sometimes it's the victim. The victim changes our perspective on how we speak for them. Cows don't matter in many people's eyes. In vegans' eyes, I know they do. But we've objectified them so much that people don't even think they're worth any notice at all. They're just objects. They're objects to be used for sandwiches. So if you're in the animal's position, would you want someone to speak out for you? And that's a very big question I ask myself. If I was in that position, I'd want someone to help me. And the animals could save themselves if they could. Trust me. I see the desperation in their eyes every time we stop a slaughterhouse truck. Those little chickens, those beautiful pigs, going into their demise. That's the only gift they get after a life of suffering is a gas chamber or a knife across their throat. If we don't speak up, who will? No one else is going to do it if vegans don't do it. And our job isn't to turn everyone vegan just to plant seeds like what I'm doing today. Plant some seeds. If people can take that information and do what they will with it. You can't control what people do with that information. It's up to them. All we can do is plant seeds and hope for the best. Don't get distressed if not everyone goes vegan when you educate them on a certain topic. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. Another Martin Luther King quote. And I know it can be hard. Sometimes you can lose hope as a vegan activist. But what I like to focus on is I just come back from the UK. Okay, 6,000 of us marching through London. They shut down the streets of London for us, okay? Screaming for animal liberation. They have to start listening to us soon. We just come back from Israel, the biggest animal rights march on earth ever. You should have seen what it looked like from the sky. 30,000 of us marching for animal liberation. If you're ever losing hope, think of that. Think of how fast this movement is growing exponentially, okay? Now, it takes a little bit of courage to do this, but you're not born with courage. Courage comes from stepping outside of your comfort zone. When I first got out of gangs, got out of jail and got sober, I was scared shitless, sorry, to go out and do activism. But I gradually stepped out of my comfort zone and I developed courage over time. Feel the fear and do it anyway. And realize that you're not alone. We're all in this together in solidarity, okay? And we should all be here supporting each other. Once you've seen the violence, I was inside a halal slaughterhouse and I bared witness to an animal being killed, okay? I was in that slaughterhouse. I took on all that suffering. I could smell the fear. It doesn't smell like death in there. It smells like cold-blooded murder, okay? And I looked into that animal's eyes as she was dying, okay? Now, I had a bunch of support from people. Are you okay, Joey? Are you okay? I felt like I was okay. I was a bit traumatic. But the point was, bunch of vegans rallied behind me. Are you okay? This is what we need to do for each other. It's hard knowing all this suffering. It's bittersweet. Sweet because we have the power to do something, but bitter because you see this massive injustice and no one's doing nothing about it. And it can be a very hard burden to carry. That's why we need to be there for each other. Another quote I like to remember while I'm doing activism is, the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who stand by and do nothing, okay? Now that is something you need to know and sort of reiterate to yourself as a vegan. Repeat that to yourself. Okay, now I just want to thank everyone for listening to my talk, and I always leave with this quote. The truth is like a lion. It needs no one to defend it. You set the truth free, it will defend itself. So you got the truth on your side. All right, thank you very much.